So does current Warhammer 40K require too many models per army, and is the game more Horde-y than it should be? Let's talk about some of the effects of points decreases on 40k as a whole. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k points decreases and legions of models on the tabletop. Well, I thought it would be worth taking a video to talk about the common talking points that 40k is requiring really quite a lot of models on the table for a lot of factions now, including ones that you'd expect to be kind of elite. I think quite a lot of this has been coming from Games Workshop's latest balance update, the big one that was really the first big pass of 10th edition to try and get armies a bit more in line with each other, and kind of desperately needed seeing as there were some armies on 31% win rates when there were some on 70. At least for tournament standings, they managed to smash a lot more of the armies roughly into the middle of the board. Overall, from an external balance, things are definitely a lot better than they used to be by a very big margin. Quite a lot of the rebalancing was done by using points cuts though, so basically any weaker units in the game go down a bit in points cost, so you can field more of them in game should you wish to. Games Workshop went very heavy on the points changes, changing points cost on literally something like a third of the models in the entire game of 40k. Perhaps bigger and more wide-reaching than virtually any points update that they've done before, really. The vast majority of those changes were points decreases as opposed to increases. Even with armies that were generally fairly solid, they tended to decrease more things than they increased, and just increase the cost of the things that were best for the factions. Usually points cuts are generally fairly well received by most players. It means that lesser played units get a bit of a new lease of life without Games Workshop having to mess with their rules or anything. But since the update, it definitely feels like a talking point has been that a lot of the armies are just a lot less elite than you might expect them to be, particularly things like certain Space Marine factions, and that definitely has a fair few negatives as well as positives. Having said that, I still definitely think it's worth doing balance updates. It means that when armies get out of line, they can try and make them a bit more on a level playing field, even though it's definitely an inexact science. When Games Workshop does make balance updates, though, they've got lots of different levers that they could pull. They could do points changes versus rules changes, and in the last one they did do a mix of the both. Say for example like armies like Death Guard and Leagues of Votann, which both got sweeping points decreases and also rules buffs as well. You could probably argue that they could try and rebalance the game with rules changes, though that definitely does have its downsides as you just add to the rule bloat in 40k. It's maybe not the most helpful for newer players to any one faction if they have to remember a whole ton of add-on rules that have gradually built up over time. Otherwise, for points increases versus points decreases, that's basically the debate of nerfs versus buffs. In general, I'd certainly say that armies getting buffed and having points drops tends to be more popular than armies getting massive points nerfs, as it leaves a few more players in the situation where they feel that their army just overall got better as opposed to suddenly got worse. Though I think in reality a mix is probably healthiest, as otherwise you're just going to be adding more and more models to people's army, as is the subject of today's video. Just to try and roughly summarise people's main gripes with this, it's not really complaints that actual proper Horde-style armies are being played everywhere. I generally consider a Horde-style army in Warhammer 40k to be really quite a lot of models, maybe somewhere in excess of 120 or something, and as we'll mention in a second, there's definitely been much bigger Hordes in the past. I think perhaps the primary complaint is that quite a lot of elite troops out there just don't really feel very elite in terms of the game, perhaps most easily seen by some of the points cost of things that you'd consider at least fairly good troops in Warhammer 40k. Say for example 12 points for a Firstborn Crusader Initiate from the Black Templars, 16 points for a Plague Marine of Nurgle, supposedly on natural resilience and fighting with all sorts of attrition blight warfare, or 11 points for a Corpuscari Electro Priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Typically a lot of these are tended to cost a fair bit more than that, and it's perhaps particularly weird for the Space Marines as they're getting all their war gear included now when they didn't used to in the past. I think some people just find it a bit weird when you're putting down these supposedly elite troops on the board and then they just don't really contribute all that much to the game, or they die in droves surprisingly easily. Again, something maybe a little bit unexpected for Space Marines, seeing as they've generally costed a few more points than these sort of costs, at least since Games Workshop rolled out 2 wounds for all of them. As well as just looking at individual units, you can also look at it as a more sort of army scale. How many models would you expect to be playing with a game of Warhammer 40k? Perhaps particularly at certain points brackets, as a lot of people like to collect up to 2,000 points to potentially have the idea that they could go to tournaments and things, and points cost do tend to be at least fairly standardised there. If say you were collecting Tau or Leagues of Votann or something towards a 2,000 point army list, and then suddenly Games Workshop goes and cuts the points cost of all your units massively, it might mean that you've just got even further away than you were, despite a lot of work and despite buying a lot of kits from Games Workshop. I'm sure they've generated at least some sales by people having extra points left over in their army and then having to go out and get something else to fill them. There's also a bit of a cost in the hobby time and effort to try and get an army together. Obviously that's an enjoyable part of the hobby for most people, but still if you're trying to get together an excessive amount of models, then not everyone is really all that down for that. I feel like Adeptus Mechanicus is perhaps a good example of an army that's now going to cost you an absolute ton, and also take a huge amount of hobby time with their very detailed and very cheap little miniatures in-game. Finally, for the in-game experience, it can be a little bit of a negative for some people there. More models on the table generally means more time and effort to play any one game of 40k. Lots of Marine players wouldn't really be all that used to having to manage their time massively efficiently, at least in terms of mechanical moving models and rolling dice and things. More veteran Horde players might be a bit more used to that kind of thing, and being careful to think ahead and maybe taking shortcuts like using movement trays. Never mind the sort of medium elite armies like Admech, Sisters or Leagues of Votan out there. Perhaps one good example of this would be the Black Templar Horde style army list that I made a little while back. Obviously you can absolutely play Black Templars with a whole load less models, and it's not like a Horde mode type army is particularly unfluffy for them, it's often how they operate. But still it is kind of crazy that just fielding their base troops with the very low points cost that they have, you can field over 150 Space Marines on the board. That's basically a company and a half by normal standards, though admittedly quite a lot of these are neophytes as well. Technically, if you did go very much down the Carapace armor type route, you could actually go slightly higher than this by including some scout squads now as well, as they're even cheaper than these at 11 points per model. As mentioned, for armies that cost a bit more, I feel like Admech are definitely a good example of this, both in terms of points cuts and being very expensive already. Most of the Adeptus Mechanicus kits already tended to cost between around about 1 or 2 points per dollar, which means that if you didn't have any other ways to reduce that at all, you'd be expected to spend somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 for a 2,000 point list, though admittedly a few of their units are a bit more efficient for that sort of thing, like the Castellan robots. A lot of their units are just very, very cheap for what you'd expect though. Vanguard are only 8 points per model, despite having fully equipped squads with all sorts of special weapons and things. That's only 1.5 points per dollar there. And it's far worse for a fair few more of their elite units, things like Skystalkers on just 65 points, Corpuscari Electro Priest on 55 points, and things like Cerberus Sulphurhounds or Ironstrider Ballistari both break the 1 point per dollar limit. They are just a fantastically expensive army to collect at the moment, maybe out of reach of quite a lot of people as a result, at least for bigger games. With all the potential downsides, it probably is just worth still mentioning that not everyone finds it a massive problem. Maybe I should have done a community poll for this sort of thing, but I feel like if you ask the average hobbyist, then you'd get more people saying that 40k should probably try and reduce its model count a bit. They definitely have a big subset of people who are still very happy with the way that things stand right now. Lots of people do enjoy the bigger games that you can field. Horde-style Black Templars are definitely enjoyed by some people. Some people with bigger collections might enjoy being able to field more of it in any one game than they could before, and sometimes, particularly for smaller points game limits, it can make certain things viable that just aren't really all that viable if each individual unit is too expensive. Certain synergy models that buff other ones might be just a little bit more useful if you've got more units to buff, and you might not be able to justify them otherwise. I would also say that in context, while actual proper Horde-style armies probably aren't really the main cause of discussion here, I would bear in mind that in 40k's past, actual proper Horde-style armies could have been considered somewhat problematic. Say for example, when 8th edition launched and you had 3 points Guard conscripts and Guard infantry squads for 40 points, you could just create hordes on the board that were just ridiculously powerful, often more units than enemies could reasonably deal with. And with additions of things like, say, orders for the guard, they could actually have okay damage output as well, and grind down the enemy army over time. It maybe wasn't uncommon to see things like Orc Boys armies of around 180 models in 8th edition as well, or similar sort of numbers for Demon Plaguebearer hordes. And if you messed around with detachments a bit and maxed them out, you could field absolute ultra hordes of, say, things like Grots or Brimstone Horrors, having something like 400 plus models on the board if it made sense. They wouldn't really be killing very much, but at the same time that can just be a bit of a problem for a lot of armies if they just don't have enough bullets to put enough down. It might not have been the worst idea by Games Workshop to try and limit the excesses of that. Typically most Horde-style armies tend to have a minimum points cap that's around about 4 or 5 points at the very lowest, and with the 10th edition army construction things you can only take a certain amount of units of each of them, so you can't just field an entire army that's 100% grots now. If people did feel that there were too many models in any given army though, it could be possible to sort that out yourselves as a player group potentially. If you feel like 2,000 point games are just a little bit too model intensive, you could just agree to play more games at 1750 perhaps. I feel like at those sort of points discrepancies you're not really going to vary too much from Games Workshop's idea of balance at 2,000. Though a few armies might feel it a little bit more than others, say for example really big points intensive ones like knights maybe. You could also play some smaller games at either 1000 points or 1500 points, and I guess slightly Horde-y style armies might make those sort of game modes actually a little bit more interesting, given that you get more individual units on the table, at least for a fair few of the armies affected by this. I feel like extra Horde armies have perhaps been a bit of a talking point over the last month or so. It'll be interesting to see if Games Workshop actually feels like it's on their radar that's enough of an issue to actually try and do something about it in some way, or whether at the moment they're going to be happy to leave things roughly how they are. They have acknowledged that it can get to problematic levels at some points in the past. For example, in the run-up between 8th and 9th edition, they put up army points by around about 10% across the board, explicitly to try and counteract their points cut creep, and stopping the amounts of units that people could take from getting out of hand. I do remember that when they did that at the time though, there were absolutely loads of people who would comment on things and being disappointed that their army was receiving points rises, perhaps just due to most people assuming that if your points go up, then it's generally going to be a bad thing for your faction's power in game. Otherwise, perhaps they could gradually address it over balance passes and things, and maybe opt to have a next couple of balance passes where you primarily increase points as opposed to drop points on weaker stuff. Again, with that, you might just run the risk of making some armies players a little bit unhappy though, and not really having much positivity for weaker factions in return. In any case though, let me know what you think. Do you feel that 40k is too Horde-y at the moment, or does it not bother you all that much? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.